This is Sahiti on behalf of Edureka, and I welcome you to this session on UiPath Advanced Training. So in this session, guys, we'll mainly focus on the advanced concepts of UiPath, and the main concept that we're going to discuss is the ReFramework of UiPath, right? So without any further ado, let's get started with the session. So before I start with the session, let's take a look at the topics that I'm going to cover in today's session. So the topics that I'm going to cover in today's session are, as you can see on my screen. We'll start this session by understanding why ReFramework, and then we'll look into what exactly ReFramework is. After that, we'll understand how to use ReFramework, and then I'll talk about the ReFramework architecture. And after you understand the ReFramework architecture, I'll talk about the different states that are present in the ReFramework architecture. So I hope the agenda is clear to you guys. So now before I move on with the session, let me just tell you that if you're someone who is looking to learn the top trending technologies in today's market, then I request you to subscribe to our Edureka YouTube channel to get daily notifications on the top trending technologies, right? So now let's just get started with the session. So now before I talk about the advanced concepts of UiPath, let me give you a short recap on the concepts you need to know before you understand this concept of ReFramework, right? So as we all know that UiPath is an RPA tool, let's start our session by understanding what exactly RPA is. So RPA is basically a process of automating the workflows with the help of robots or softwares to reduce the involvement of humans in performing any kind of actions, right? So over here, if you observe the term robotic process automation, then there are mainly three terms that you have to understand in that is robotic, process, and automation. So starting with robotics are basically any entities which mimic human actions. So any entities which mimic human actions are called as robots. Coming to process is basically a sequence of steps which lead to a meaningful activity. So if you understand this term robots, then robots are designed to perform a set of tasks, right? So those tasks are performed by following a sequence of steps, and these sequence of steps is nothing but a process. And finally, coming to automation. So any process which is done by a robot without any human intervention is said to be automated, right? So now if we combine all these three terms together, then mimicking human actions to perform a sequence of steps that lead to a meaningful activity without any human intervention is known as robotic process automation, right? So basically this is what robotic process automation is, guys. Now, once you understand robotic process automation, you also have to understand the fact that each process in RPA has to undergo a life cycle, right? So next, let me just brief you about the life cycle of RPA. So the RPA lifecycle has mainly 5 stages and an additional stage, which is basically to execute your designed pod. So the stages of the RPA lifecycle are the discovery phase, solution design phase, development phase, the user acceptance test, the deployment phase, and finally the execution of the bots, right? So I'm not going to go into the depth of each of these phases. If you want to know more about each of these phases, then you can refer to my session on RPA lifecycle. Now over here, if you observe in the RPA lifecycle, we have defined the stages from discovery of the client requirements to finally execution of the bots, right? Now the bots are basically deployed using an RPA tools, right? So next, let's discuss the top RPA tools. So well, there are humongous amount of tools present in today's RPA industry, but the top 3 tools present in the market are UiPath, Automation Anywhere, and Blue Prism. So since this session is basically focusing on UiPath, I'm going to focus on UiPath more. So for example, let's say you want to automate a task, right? So what you will do is you'll choose your requirements, and then you'll understand whether that a particular task can be automated or not. And then you'll choose the tool out of the top tools present in the market based on your requirement, right? So over here, I'm going to talk about UiPath more. Now, since we're talking about UiPath, or we are stressing about UiPath, let me just tell you how you can install UiPath. Well, guys, installing UiPath is really simple. You first have to go to their official website, and then you'll have to fill in the details basically. After that, you'll open your registered email, where you'll get an email from UiPath saying that you can click on this button to download. So you just have to click on that button to download the file, and then just double click the downloaded file to start installing it, right? After the setup will initialize, you have to enter your registered email address, and then you'll see that UiPath is loading. So let me just quickly show you the official website of UiPath. So if I just search for UiPath, and then if I open this, you'll clearly see that you have an option of start trial. So you just have to click over here, And then you have options for community edition and the enterprise edition. So basically the community edition is the free edition that you can use for lifetime purposes, and enterprise edition is a paid version, so you can download either of them based on your requirement. So once you choose either of the editions, let's say we choose community edition. So let's just wait for that to happen. So you'll clearly see that you have to enter your details. So apart from that, you also have options like sign up with Google, LinkedIn, and other social medias. But if you choose sign up with email, then you'll have to enter your first name, last name, country, email address, company name, and so on, right? After that, you just click on sign up and then you're good to go, right? So that's how you basically install UiPath, guys. Now in UiPath, there are mainly three components that you have to understand. That is UiPath Studio, Robot, and Orchestrator. So Studio is basically a visual dashboard, or you can consider it as a GUI dashboard in which you can basically design your automation, right? So if you have to design your automation, then obviously you'll have to follow a sequence of steps, right? So those steps can be very much defined in the UiPath Studio. Coming to the UiPath Robot, the robot is basically used to execute the automation workflow that you must have created in the UiPath Studio. And finally, coming to Orchestrator. So Orchestrator is also a product of UiPath, which enables you to orchestrate the UiPath robots in continuously executing repetitive process on various platforms, right? So now since we're going to work on UiPath Studio to understand the ReFramework, I'm going to just give you an overview of the UiPath Studio. So let me just open UiPath Studio for you. Alright, so guys, when you open your UiPath Studio, this is the first screen that you see. So over here on the left hand side, you have the various kinds of projects or templates that you can use. And on the right hand side, you have a list of the recent projects that you must have worked on, right? So for example, if I could just click on the process project, you just have to mention the project name, the location where the project should be stored, and the description of the project, and then you can click on create. So once you click on create, you'll actually see the different components of the visual dashboard of that UiPath offers. So let's just wait for that to happen. All right. So as you can see on my screen, guys, this is how the visual dashboard of UiPath looks. So basically, there are four panes that you need to understand. That is the ribbon pane, the activities pane, the output pane, and the properties pane, right? So for example, let me just, drag this output pane so that you can clearly see. And even in the project, let me just go to the activities tab, right? So this is basically that you need to understand. So in the ribbon pane, you have various options like, start, design, execute, which again have various other options for different functionalities. In the activities pane, you have a list of activities that you can simply drag and drop into the workspace. So for example, let's say, I want to drag and drop an assign activity. I can just drag and drop it over here, right? And then you can just assign values. After that, in the output pane, you'll basically see the output of your execution of your project. Now over here, we haven't done any execution, so you won't see anything presently. And the properties pane is basically used to configure the properties of each and every activity, right? So irrespective of the activity, any activity's properties can be configured, right? So guys, this was about UiPath Studio. Well, I just covered all these concepts very quickly. If you want a detailed understanding of all these concepts and you want to understand how UiPath can be used, then you can refer to our RPA playlist of Edureka, and then you'll get a detailed understanding of each and every concept of RPA and UiPath, right? So I hope everything until now is clear. So now that you've got an overview of the basic concepts of UiPath, let me start with the main topic for today's session, that is the RE frameworks or the Robotic Enterprise Framework. So first, let us understand why do we exactly need the RE framework. So let me just explain you with an example. Now consider a scenario wherein you're automating a particular task. Let's say the process of extracting the data from various invoices, right? Now to automate this process, we need to mention the folder from which the invoices have to be read, then identify the fields, basically all the fields from which we want the data to be extracted, right? So obviously, if you just observe into this task, you cannot completely automate the process, right? So what I mean by that is the complete intervention of human cannot be removed from this particular process, right? You need a human employee to sit there and then allocate the folder from which the invoices have to be read, and also make the UiPath understand which fields have to be extracted, and also look into the factor of which invoices are already read and which are not, right? So basically, to avoid human intervention, we have to define the robots in such a way that they can be used in every possible situation, And this is where basically the RE framework comes into the picture. This framework is basically a template that helps the user define the process that offer a way to store, read, and easily modify the project configuration data with robust exception handling scheme and event logging for all the exceptions and also the relevant transaction information. This framework logs messages at each and every relevant step towards solving a business transaction and sends those logs to the orchestrator server. This in turn can be connected to a database to where all the data can be stored, right? So if I have to summarize the need of RE framework for you, then it directly implies to the qualities that each and every robot should possess, right? So the reasons are, as you can see on my screen, that is basically the proper exception handling, recovery abilities, supports logging mechanism, reporting functionalities, high performance, high maintainability, high extensibility, reusability, and finally the ease of development, right? So the need of ReFramework is really simple, guys. Whenever we want to remove the human intervention completely and design our robots in such a way that they can perform in each and every situation is basically where the ReFramework comes into the picture, right? So now that you know why we need ReFramework, let's look into what exactly ReFramework is, right? Well, if I have to explain ReFramework for you, then ReFramework can be considered as the starting point of every project. So to explain you this point, let's consider a scenario of a business process. Now, before I move on with our business process, let me tell you that each business process consists of multiple distinct in scope and in purpose collection of components, and each component can have many transactions, right? So a business process can have around 5-6 components, or even maybe more than that, or maybe less than that, and then each component can again have a set of transactions. So a collection of relatable business transaction forms a business process component, and a business component is a part of the complete business process that you're working on. So now to explain you further, I've considered the scenario that you can see on my screen. So our scenario is basically to update the prices of the courses of the competitors' companies into our database so that we can compare and then we can understand the market values of each and every course and our companies, right? Now, the business process that I've considered will basically have 3 components. The first component will basically consist of a process which is executed daily to read the prices of the courses offered by the competitors' companies, right? After that, the second component will basically compare the prices of the courses offered by our company to that of the competitor's company. And finally, the third component will update the prices in the database and notify the respective team about the updated prices, right? So guys, these are basically the 3 components that our business process will consist of. So now once you've figured out the components, each component can be further divided into business transactions, right? So in our scenario, I've considered the transactions for each component to be as you can see on my screen. So our first component will basically have 3 business transactions. That is, the first transaction is to basically get a list of courses to which we want to compare the prices. After that, the second transaction will basically save the list of courses, and the third transaction will basically check the latest prices of the courses. The second component will basically compare the missing factors. So for example, let's say, the competitors have some course live on their website, but they haven't released the price of the course either in India or maybe any other nation, right? Also, the second transaction of this component will basically identify the differences in the prices of the courses offered by our company to that of the competitor's company. And finally, coming to the third component, in the third component, the first transaction will basically update the prices in the database and then notify the respective team about the updating of the prices. So basically, the notifying part is done by the second transaction. And finally, coming to the third transaction is basically used to generate a report of those prices, right? So basically, guys, in our scenario, you can have 3 components and then each component can have these transactions, right? So basically, if you have understood from my example, then each business process is basically a collection of components, and further, the components are a collection of transactions. If you're wondering where does ReFramework come into the picture, then let me tell you that the Robotic Enterprise Framework, or the RE framework, is a template which is used to create automation workflows in a modular approach for large-scale deployments. So basically, it is used to set up the project configuration for each and every loop to perform a set of actions. So when you start working on RE framework, you'll basically understand that, you'll set up a set of actions for each and every loop. So basically, those set of actions will iterate for each and every loop. And then finally, the action will be performed, or maybe you'll see an output, right? So basically, it goes for a loop. So don't worry, I'm going to explain you the different components of the RE framework to understand how you can actually do the stuff, right? So now moving on with our session, next let's look into how to exactly use this RE framework, right? So to use RE framework, what you have to do is you have to first identify the components of your business processes and then understand where could be the areas of exceptions and reporting of logs. After that, you have to open your UiPath Studio and you have to start the UiPath's Robotic Enterprise Framework template. And after that, you have to start just customizing the blocks which are present already in that framework, right? So the customizing part of these blocks is basically how you want your transaction, or basically how you want your business process to work on, right? So I'm going to explain you about each and every component of that RE framework very soon. So now before I just move on with the explanation part of those components, let me just quickly open the project and show you. So when I click on the start button on the left hand side, you'll see various kinds of projects and templates you can use in UiPath, right? So over there, you see an option of Robotic Enterprise Framework. So if I just double click on that, you can just mention the name, location, and the description of your project. So let's say we just mentioned Robotic Enterprise Framework demo, and then let the location and the description be the same, and then I'll just click on create. So once I click on create, you'll see that your project is loading. So let's just wait for that to happen. All right, so as you can see, this is how your RE framework looks like. It has various states and machines. So now if you just go back to your project tab over here, you'll clearly see the various dependencies and the various files this particular process has, right? Now over here, out of all these files, you don't have to change the settings for all the files. You just have to change the settings for few files. So some files remain the same as they are, and some basically get changed based on your business process, right? Apart from that, we have this main file. So the main file is basically the file which executes when a project is deployed and published onto the orchestrator server. So this is the file which basically executes, right? So over here, you have to configure the file based on your business processes again. All right. So this was all about how to use RE framework. Next, let's look into the RE framework architecture. So the RE framework architecture basically uses the state machine diagram as you can see on my screen. So it basically has 4 states. That is the init state, the get transaction data state, the process transaction, and the end process state, right? So now before I move forward with the explanation of each and every state in detail, let me just give you an overview of the complete workflow of this RE framework, right? So any project that you create on RE framework basically starts through init state, right? So the init state is basically the state where the robot reads the configuration and initializes the application. So if the configurations can be read and all the applications are initialized, then the state is meant to be successful. So if the state is successful, then it goes to the get transaction data state. Else it just directly ends the process by showing you a system error, right? Now let's say our state was successful, then we would land onto our get transaction data state, right? So in the get transaction data state, you have 2 possible actions. That is either the new transaction comes into the picture. So basically the new transaction that comes next is processed by the robot. So once the transaction is retrieved, then it goes to the process transaction. That is basically our next state. Else, if all the transactions have been operated and then there's no more data left, then it basically goes to the end process, right? So there are basically 2 possibilities that you have to understand in the get transaction data. That is basically if there's a new transaction or if there's any new data that has to be processed, then it goes to the process transaction. Else, if there's no data and then all the transactions are taken into account, then it directly goes to the end process where the process ends, right? Now let's say we are in the process transaction state. Now in the process transaction state, there are again 3 outcomes that can come. That is either the success, the business rule exception, or the error transition, right? So the success is basically where the loop is performed and the next transaction data is taken into account. So if you remember when I was explaining about what is ReFramework, I was telling you that when the setup is initialized and then for each loop some actions have to be performed. So that particular part where we are defining for each loop, that is basically happening in our process transaction state. And where we are talking about setting up our basic requirements, that basically happens in our init state, after which we basically get the transaction data, right? Now, as I was talking about the process state, so as I just mentioned, the success state is basically used when the loop is performed and the next transaction data is taken into account. Moving on to the business rule exception. So in the business rule exception, some specific action needs to be taken, after which the execution loops back to the get transaction data state, right? Apart from that, coming to the third one, that is the system error transition. This is through which you can take all the necessary steps to receive from an error, right? So basically all the applications are closed and the execution loops back to the init state, right? So when all the applications are closed and the execution loops back to the init state, basically in the init state, again, since the applications are initialized, the applications are restarted, right? After all the actions are performed over here, we finally have the end process, which is basically used to end the process, right? So I hope you have understood the workflow of the RE framework, right? Let's take a look at all the 4 states of the RE framework. That is the init, get transaction data, process transaction, and end process. Let's start by taking a closer look at the init state. So let me just quickly shift back to UiPath Studio. Right. So now if I just double click on the init state, you'll see how it expands. Right. So basically, as I was telling you, the init state is used by the robot to read the settings and start all the applications. So this is basically where the robot reads all the configuration that you must have mentioned, and then it initializes all the applications required, right? So as you can see, we have the exception handling schema placed inside each framework. So this is why basically we have the try-catch blocks present in each and every state. So here what happens is that basically the robot will try to initialize, and if it fails so, then the process will end, right? So basically whatever we are mentioning in the try section is to initialize the actions, and then if the actions are failed to be initialized, then it directly just ends the process, right? So it just gives you an exception and then it finally just ends the process, right? So if I just scroll up, then you can clearly see that, in the first section that comes, that is the try section, what is mentioned is initialize system error. So basically that's an assign activity that is used. So this is used to basically check whether there is an exception or not. So for that, we set the exception object to the system error, and then we just initialize it with nothing, right? So basically over here, we're just initializing our system error variable to nothing. After that, as I just mentioned, that the robot has to read the configurations. Our next step is to read the config file and then start all the applications. And finally, our step is to basically catch any exception that comes into picture. So over here, that's what is mentioned. That is basically an assign activity is put, and then the system error is assigned to the exception value, and the exception type to be any common exception, right? So depending on the value of the system error, that is basically the variable that we have assigned in the try block and also in the catch block. So depending on that particular value, what happens is that either you go to the next state, that is the get transaction data state, or basically the process ends, right? So if it is successful, then it goes to the get transaction data state, as you can see over here. If it is not successful and then there's some error thrown, then it basically ends the process, right? Now let me just quickly scroll back over here again, and then let me give you a better understanding about reading the configuration file. So over here, if I just double click, you'll see that, it again opens a different sequence in which you have various other options. So basically, if you have to just understand the step, then you can just understand by the fact that, the step is used to read the configuration file. Now, reading the configuration file only happens at the beginning of the execution. So basically, when the configurations are read by the robot, then that is basically done at the initial state of the execution only. It doesn't happen at the end, because it's obvious that, if the robot doesn't understand the configuration, then obviously execution cannot happen, right? So that is the reason this happens at the beginning. Now over here, if you observe, there's an if condition that is mentioned. So over here, it is mentioned that, the config is nothing. Now, if you look into the variable pane of this particular section, you'll see that, the config is a variable. So it's basically a dictionary. And then the dictionary has the string and the objects. So the string is basically the key and the object is basically the value of the dictionary, right? Now, in this particular dictionary that is basically in config, you can store any kind of data like, number, string, data time values, and so on, right? So now when you mention the condition that, the config is nothing, you move on with the next step. That is basically if this condition is successful, then the then section of the if condition is executed. So in the then section, what your first step is to basically invoke the init all settings.xaml file, right? So this basically happens from the framework folder that you can see on the left hand side. So over here, this is basically the XAML file that is being invoked, right? Now over here, if you observe this particular activity, you also have few input arguments, right? So if you just double click over here, you'll clearly see that, you have two input arguments, that is the in-config file and the in-config sheets. Now the in-config file basically consists of the path of the configuration file located in the default data folder. And the in config sheets indicates the sheets which contain the configuration data, right? So that is basically the different sheets present in the configuration file, and also those particular sheets have the configuration data, right? Now, apart from this, we also have the output arguments. Now, the output argument is again the out config, which is a dictionary value again, in which the string is the key and the object is the value, right? So if I just click on OK, this gets closed, right? Now, before I move on with the next activity, let me tell you over here that, the init all settings.xaml file is basically the plug and play. So you basically don't have to change anything in this particular file when you're working for your business process. It's going to be the same for each and every business process, and then you don't have to configure much about it, right? So as I was talking about the configuration file, so before I move forward, let me just open the configuration file and show you. Project folder is this. So if I go to data, you see the config file over here, right? So if I just double click over here, you'll see that in its opening. So let's just wait for that to happen. All right. So once it has opened, basically guys, this is how your config file looks. So it basically has three sections, that is the settings, the constants, and the assets, right? So all these sections have their own functionalities and features. The settings is basically used to put any configuration related to the business process, like, URL, file path, credential names, or anything which is specific to that particular business process, right? Coming to constants. Constants is basically used to store the technical settings for the developers. Like when I say technical settings, what I mean by that is, you can store the number of retries, timeouts, delays, image accuracy settings, static log message paths, and so on, right? So basically, the constants part is basically used to store the technical settings for the developers. And finally, coming to the assets part. So the assets part is basically used to store the values which override the default settings, right? Now, if I just shift back to the settings part, over here you basically see three columns, right? That is the name, value, and the description. So the name basically always contains string, that is the key in the dictionary. So if you remember, I was talking about the config variable, right? So the config variable was a dictionary in which we had string and object, and the string was a key, right? So basically, whatever is present in the name folder is considered as a string, and that is present in our key section of our config variable. Coming to value, the value holds the dictionary value. So in the config variable, whatever was object is basically our value. And finally, coming to the description. So the description provides a detailed account of each and every string, right? Now moving on to the next sheet, that is constant. So the constants, as I was telling you, basically consists of the technical stuff that is required for the developers. So these are basically used to avoid hard coding and time delays. So these config objects basically allow easy global value adjustments, right? You can just, define the configuration over here, and then you don't have to define it again and again and again, right? So with these, we can improve the performance and also fine tune the projects for different environments, right? Now, if you observe the columns, then again, it has the same columns, that is the name, value, and the description. So for example, if you just consider the max retry number, the max retry number is basically used to keep account of the retries of the transactions which have failed due to an application exception or a system error, right? So since we're using the template of the ReFramework, and this template is basically designed to by default work with the orchestrator queues, but then it can also be used to suit other types of input data like Excel, email, folders, and so on, right? So by default, the max retry number is assigned to 0, and the number of retries is set in orchestrator. Of course, this number can be changed, allowing the robot to retry the failed transactions if the queue functionality does not work, right? Apart from that, we also have others such as timeout short, timeout medium, timeout long. This is basically used to find out the timeout value in milliseconds for the activities which are likely to fail. So they basically have a limit. So the timeout short has a limit of 5,000, the timeout medium has a limit of 30,000, and the timeout long has a limit of 1,20,000, right? After this, we have the X screenshots folder part. So the X screenshot folder part is basically used to save the exception screenshot, and that particular screenshots can be used to solve out the exceptions if any exceptions occur in a business process. Coming to delay short, delay medium, and delay long. So the delay short, delay medium, delay long is basically used for the activities where it is necessary to wait for a little while, right? So again, the delay short, delay medium, and delay long basically have their own limits. So the delay short, as you can see, has 1,000, delay medium has 15,000, and delay long has 60,000, right? After that, we have the accuracy low, accuracy medium, and accuracy high. So this is basically used to define the image accuracy. So either the image accuracy can be low, medium, or high, right? So the images which have high contrast basically have accuracy low. The images which have a normal contrast which have accuracy medium, and the images which have low contrast have accuracy high, right? So again, these particular strings have their own value set. So the accuracy low is at 0.6, accuracy medium is at 0.8, and accuracy high is at 0.9. And finally, coming to the log message, get transaction data, log message, get transaction data error, success, business rule exception, and application exception have the functionality of static part of logging message. So the first one, that is the log message get transaction data, is basically used when you call the get transaction data and that particular processing transaction number value is stored. Coming to log message get transaction data error, this basically logs the error retrieving the transaction data. Over here, we basically store the error getting transaction data for transaction number. Coming to log message success. So the log message success is basically used to process the transaction successfully. So whatever transaction is successful, that particular transaction value can be stored. Coming to log message business rule exception, this is basically used to log the part where the process transaction failed with business exception. So over here, you store the business rule exception. Finally, coming to log message application exception. So the log message application exception is basically used to log the message of process transaction failing with application exception, right? So over there, you store the system exception, right? So basically, guys, this was all about the config file. So guys, with this, we come to an end to understand the config file. So over here, we understood three main sheets that the config file has, that is the settings, constants, and the assets, right? Now, once the config file is basically read, if you move back to our UiPath Studio, the next step that comes into picture is to save the job arguments config, right? So this is basically used to save job arguments with the values to config using the argument's name as the key name, right? So if I just double click over here, you see that, we have an if condition where the if condition says not string is null or empty, and then you mention the orchestrator queue name, right? So as I was talking about the configuration file, so once the configuration file is read and then the robot understands the arguments which need to be considered, it basically saves the arguments over here, right? So it basically keeps adding all the arguments to a dictionary with strings and objects as key and value, right? So that is basically happening in the then condition where we're basically assigning the config orchestrator queue name to the orchestrator queue name value, right? So that is what is basically happening over here. Now, if I go back to the init state and then if I go back to the read config part over here, the next step that we see after save job arguments config is basically to kill all the processes, right? So basically, we are invoking the kill all processes XAML file from the framework folder again. Now, what happens is that the robot has to start in a clean and a concise environment, right? So what you do is you add the log fields, that is add the business process name to store the log of the process. So whatever processes are not working and then they're not for further use are basically killed. So it's really simple. You just have to go by the name, that is to just kill all the processes. After you kill all the processes, next what you have to do is you have to add the log fields. So the add log fields is basically used to add the business process names. This is used to log the data, what business process is going on. So this is just for exception handling to understand if there's any exception, then which business process is creating a problem, right? Now, once you read all the config file, you kill the process and then you add the log fields. If you go back to the init state, the next state that comes into picture is to init all the applications, right? So the init all applications also happens with the XAML file present in the framework folder, that is the init all applications. Now this is where basically all the applications are initialized, or you can understand that, the applications have started, right? Now this particular XAML file is basically parameterized depending on what applications are used in the process. So this is where basically you'll have to change the configuration based on your requirement, right? It should be basically parameterized on the business process that you have, what values that you want to use, and so on, right? So over here, if you just see the arguments, then we have the in-config value as the input dictionary. So basically, it is a dictionary value with the key as the string and the value as the object, right? So if I just click on OK, and if I just go one step back and then go to init state, this is where basically our init state completely ends. And then, if all these steps are successful and then there's no system error, the next state that comes into picture is the get transaction data state. So the get transaction data state is basically a data retrieval mechanism which is necessary to complete a transaction in a process. So the transactions are basically defined as repetitive part of the processes with each and every execution of the transactions numbered, right? So for example, if you just consider the example of, a support system, right? So they have a lot of tickets coming up, right? So each ticket has a different number, right? So those particular ticket numbers are unique and therefore they can be used as the transaction numbers, right? So the value stored in the transaction variables is by default 1. So if I just drag the variable pane, you can clearly see that, the value stored in the transaction number variable by default is 1, right? So it starts with 1 and then it gradually increments within counter, right? So the next variable that you have to understand again over here is the transaction item. So the transaction item is basically a queue item by default, and then you can change this type of data type. That is, you can make it either email, Excel, folders, and so on, right? So that's completely your call and based on what kind of business process that you're working on. But by default, it has the queue item, right? Now, if you just start with the activities of the get transaction data, then you'll see that, the first thing that comes into picture is the check stop signal. So the check stop signal is basically used to check, whether our robot is working or not. If we basically stop our robot, then it would directly go to the end process state to basically end the process. But yes, if no stop signal is received from the orchestrator, then basically what happens is that we have to perform the further steps in the get transaction data state, right? So over here, if you just scroll down, you'll see the condition should stop, right? So over here in the check stop signal, if I drag the property section, you'll see that, the result is stored in the should stop variable, right? So if that particular variable is successful, that means our robot has received a signal to be stopped, then a log message will come up with saying that, the stop process requested. So basically that particular log message will be stored into your log folder and the transaction item will be assigned to nothing, right? Apart from that, if we do not receive any should stop folder, then you can see the else section will be executed. So in the else section, what will happen is that we'll move forward by invoking the get transaction data XAML file, right? So if I just double click over here, you mainly see two input arguments, right? So that is the transaction number and the config. So the transaction number is an integer data type where you basically store the transaction number, and the config is basically a dictionary, as I previously mentioned, which consists of string and object in the key and the value section. Apart from that, we have the out transaction field 1, field 2, out transaction ID and data, all other as output arguments, which are basically used for logging purposes, right? So now if I just, right click this activity and then if I just click on open workflow, so you'll clearly see that, this opens a different workflow which is stored in that particular XAML file, right? When you open this workflow, you clearly see a description which says that, this particular workflow is designed to get data from spreadsheets, database, emails, and so on, right? So if no new data is set, then set out transaction item to nothing. If there's new data, then we have to configure over here, right? So for linear processes, which are basically not repetitive, the set out transaction item only for one transaction number, that is the first transaction only. But yes, if the transaction is repeatable, then what happens is that you have to assign a new out transaction item by using the transaction number to index the transaction data, right? So I'm going to show you what's happening over here. So the first thing that comes into picture is the get queue item. So basically the get transaction item. So in the get transaction item, what happens is that if you see the properties section, you'll see that, the output is basically a queue item, right? That is basically a transaction item in the form of queue. Now, this particular transaction ID output argument should be unique for each and every transaction, right? So obviously, if you have around 10 transactions, so this particular ID should be unique for each and every transaction so that the actions with respect to that particular transactions are successful, right? Now, if there's no data, like for example, let's say there's no new data, then obviously the process stops. And then if there is new data, then we move on to the process transaction, right? Now, apart from that, at some point of time of the workflow, what happens is all the transactions are being already processed, right? So there are no new transactions which have to be processed or which have to be read by the robot, right? So then what happens is that the robot should stop and then you should go to the end process state. So this basically occurs when the transaction item becomes nothing or null, or when you use the orchestrator queue that happens by default when there are no more new items to be sent, right? So that's what we are doing. We're setting a condition which says out transaction item is not nothing, right? So if it is nothing, then what happens is that, your robot should stop and then it should just directly go to the end process, right? But yes, if it is not nothing and there's some new data, then what happens is that you write the data to the added fields that identify the transaction, right? So the out transaction ID is assigned to now.string, and the out transaction field 1 is assigned to string.empty, and the out transaction field 2 is again assigned to string.empty, right? Now, before I move back to my main file, I would like to tell you one thing over here. That is, if you change the type of the transaction type. So over here, it was queue item, right? If it was not that, then you have to assign it to null and not nothing. And then what will happen is the report will identify whether it has to take you forward to the next step or if it has to end the process, right? Now let me just shift back to my main file, and then let me just, drag the property section back. And in the else section of this particular activity, let me just show you the catch block. So the catch block has an exception. So basically what we're doing is we're just logging an exception which says, the level is fatal. So over here, if you observe, the level in a log message activity is used for the user's perspective to understand if it's an error, if it's a warning, if it's a trace, and so on, right? So it's just for the user's perspective. So if you just mention fatal over here, and then the message is mentioned that the log message get transaction data error to string, and then we are mentioning the transaction number, also the exception source, right? After that, we're just ending the process. That is, we are just assigning the transaction item to nothing. So as soon as you assign the transaction item to nothing, you'll understand that, that particular process is going to end and there's no more new transaction data that has to be processed, right? So now if I just go back to this part, this is basically the workflow of how the get transaction data works. Just remember the fact that for every transaction that you process, the transaction number should be unique. So now let's move forward with our next stage. So as I was telling you, if this particular part is successful, that means, if the get transaction data throws a new transaction, so that means there's a new transaction which has to be processed. Then the next factor that comes into picture is the process transaction state. Else, if there's nothing to be processed, then it directly goes to the end process state, right? So now let's take a closer look at the process transaction state. So as you can see, the process transaction also has a try-catch block in which we invoke various kinds of XAML files, right? So let's understand each one of them. So starting with the try block. So the try block basically starts by invoking the process.xaml file, right? So over here, we basically need two input arguments. That is the transaction item, which is basically the queue item, and the in-config dictionary. So that is also an input argument. It again has the string and the object as the key and the values in the dictionary. Based on the execution of this particular process, we catch a business rule exception. So in the catch block, you can clearly see that, we catch this particular exception. That is basically a business rule exception, which is thrown by a throw activity, right? Now, after that, we also have a system exception to handle any unhandled exceptions thrown in the process or in the activities, right? So whenever there's any unhandled exception, that is the system exception handles that particular exception, right? Now, based on one of the three outcomes, that is basically, if you observe in the main file, there are mainly three outcomes. That is the success, rule exception, and the error. The new state is selected. So over here, if I just go back to my process transaction. So over here, if we go back to the finally section, you'll see that, we invoke the set transaction status workflow. So again, this particular XAML file is invoked from the framework folder. And basically in this, as soon as the transaction is completed, we need to set the status with appropriate logging mechanisms, right? So basically we'll have to mention that, that particular transaction is done, and then maybe we'll have to set the transaction status that, yes, it is successful and all that, right? So over here, if you just see the arguments of this particular workflow, you'll see that, we have the config file, the system error, the business rule exception as the input arguments. And basically these three arguments are used to determine the next state. That is basically whether it has to go to the end process, or maybe it has to go back to the init state, or maybe again it has to go to the get transaction data state, right? Apart from that, we also have the other input arguments such as the transaction item, the transaction field 1, field 2, and the ID. So basically these are used to basically keep a track of the transaction that is happening, and then they can definitely be altered in the transaction.xaml file. So whenever you want to alter the transaction, you just have to go back to the transaction.xaml file and then alter it over there. Apart from that, we also have the retry number and the transaction number, which are used as both input and output arguments. So the retry number, as I previously told you, is to basically keep a track of the retries of the failed transaction, and the transaction number is to keep a track of the transaction number, right? Now, if I just close this particular dialog box, and then if I just right click on this particular activity and open the workflow, So if I open the workflow of set transaction status.xaml file, you'll see that it's a simple flow chart executing three possibilities, that is success, handle business rule exceptions, and handle system errors. So we'll discuss each one of them one by one. So let's start with success. But before that, what you see over here is a flow chart. So basically, if the process is going on a success node and then it is true, then if I just double click to view this particular activity, you'll see that there's an if condition mentioned over here, right? So in the if condition, you basically have to mention the condition. The condition mentioned is basically in transaction item is not nothing, and also in transaction item dot get type is get type according to the queue item, right? So if that is the condition, and then if it is successful, then you set the transaction status, else you don't do anything, right? So basically this condition says that if the transaction item is not nothing and the transaction type is basically the queue item, then you set the transaction status to be successful. So if I just drag the properties section, you'll see the status to be successful, right? So that's what is basically done over here. You set the transaction status to be successful. And then if you want to change the type of the transaction item, then you have to first delete this activity and then you have to change the type of the transaction item, right? Apart from that, moving forward with the workflow, the next activity that comes is the add log fields. So this is basically used to log the successful message. So whenever there's a transaction which is set, then automatically the log fields would be logged where it would say that it is successful, right? Now to set this message of log to be successful, you basically use the log message activity. So as I was telling you previously also, the level is basically for the user experience to understand if it's an error, if it's a fatal, if it's a warning, and so on. So over here it is mentioned info, and in the message it is mentioned that log message success to string, right? So basically log message success would be displayed into your log files, right? Now after that, what happens is that we remove the transaction log file. So this is basically to remove the custom log fields to each log message, right? So that is done. And moving on, finally, we assign the transaction number to the next transaction, right? So basically we are assigning the variable of the transaction number to the next transaction so that the next transaction is checked. So that is basically it is initialized by the counter, right? Now after that, we also set the retry number to be 0. So if you remember in the config file also, the retry number was by default set to 0. So over here we'll just assign that particular variable to be 0. So that initially the count of retries starts with 0. And then if there are any retries for a specific transaction number, then the count is increased, right? So guys, this was all about the success state. Now moving back to the set transaction status, you'll see that, if the success is not successful, right? So basically if that state is not successful, then we go to the business rule exception. Now in the business rule exception, if I just double click over here, you'll see again an if condition, and then the same steps are executed as that of the previous one, right? So over here in the condition section, the same condition is again mentioned. That is the if the transaction item is not nothing and also the transaction.get type is basically a queue item, then what happens is that we have to set the transaction status to be failed. Now this is basically we are mentioning the fact that there's a business rule exception that has occurred and the transaction has been failed to be processed, right? So that is the reason in the set transaction status we set the status to be failed and the error type to be business and the reason to be business rule exception, so that it's clear that it's because of the business rule exception that that something has gone wrong. After that, we again just add the transaction log field. So basically we add the custom log fields to log the message, and to log the message we'll use the level to be error now because it's an error. And in the message we'll say log message business rule exception. So basically when the execution is occurred, the log message would be stored saying that log message business rule exception. So anybody who is coming back to look into this project can understand that because of the business rule exception something has gone wrong, right? So after that, we'll again similarly just remove the transaction log files to remove the custom log fields of each log message, and finally assign the transaction number to the next transaction number, right? So we basically move on to the next transaction number with the help of this assignment, and then also assign the retry number to be 0, right? So guys, this was all about the business rule exception. Now if I go back to the set transaction status and look into handle system error, so if the business rule exception is true, then this particular business rule exception part is executed. Else if it is false, then the third part is executed, that is handle system error. That is because that is the only possibility that can occur if it is not success and business rule exception, right? So if I double click over here, you'll see there's again an if condition that has to be mentioned, and then there's a little bit change in the sequence of the workflow of this particular activity, right? So let's look into the same. So starting with the condition. So the condition is the same as the conditions that we just discussed previously. That is, if the transaction item is not nothing, and also in the transaction item get type is not a queue item, obviously then we'll set the queue retry to be false. But yes, if it is the queue item and then the transaction item is not nothing, then some steps will be occurring, right? So what we'll do is we'll consider an extra variable over here, that is queue retry, right? So this is basically used to log a warning message if the queue item is being retried, and also an error otherwise, right? Now, one thing that you have to remember over here is that basically that, if we use the queue items, then the flag is always true, else it is false, right? So that is what is happening over here. Since we're using the queue item, then I've initially assigned the value to be true, that is the flag is true, else if it is not true, then obviously it is false, right? But if we would want to change the type of the transaction item to something else, then we need to remove this entire sequence, as I also was telling you previously, right? Now, after that, what you have to do is you have to set the transaction status to be failed again, obviously, because we are throwing an error, right? So that is the reason we mentioned the fact that, the transaction status has failed, and the error type to be application, because this has not happened because of the business rule application, but yes, it has happened due to the error in the application, right? So that could be the error type, and the reason to be system error message, right? So basically we're just mentioning the fact that, it's a system error. After that, what you'll do is you'll basically assign the retry number to the transaction item.retry number, right? So basically you're counting the number of retries that is happening for a specific transaction number. And then finally, you'll add the transaction log fields. So that's basically to log your messages. So this will basically add the custom log fields to the robot execution logs. And then finally, you'll put in the robot retry flowchart, right? So when I say the robot retry flowchart, this is basically a flowchart which will talk about all the retries that will happen for a specific transaction number. So if I just double click this view, you'll see that, there's a particular flowchart that happens, which only talks about the retries, if there's any maximum retries, if yes, if initially if the robot has retried or not, if not, then what is the message, if yes, then what is happening, and so on, right? So remember by default that, we're using the orchestrator queue, in which the max retry number that we assigned in the config value was 0, right? So now if you just look into this flowchart, you'll understand that, if the retry number is not enabled after the first flow decision, then the no branch of the robot retry would be executed. So over here, if you look into, there are mainly two activities that you look into. That is the log message activity with the level error, and then it displays a message saying that, the log message application exception, the source where, the exception is happening, right? So that is one thing that comes over here. Apart from that, there's also an increment in the transaction number, so that, the robot does not retry the same transaction, but instead it just moves on to the next one, right? So basically what's happening over here is we're just defining if the retry has to happen or not. If it has to happen, then we move on to the retries. If it does not have to happen, then we'll say that, there's no retry required for a specific transaction, and then the robot can just move forward, right? Now, similarly, if you consider the scenario where we are not using the queue, we can just set the max retry number in the config value to be greater than 0, right? The yes branch of the robot retry will be executed. So initially what you have to understand is the yes branch is executed when in the config file you've assigned the max retry number to be greater than 0, and the no branch is executed when in the config file the max retry number is put to 0, and then it is a queue item. For the yes branch, it is not a queue item that is getting executed. So when we're talking about the execution of the yes branch, what happens is that the robot checks if the max retry number has been reached or not, right? So this is basically used to understand the fact that, the retries of a failed transactions should not happen forever, right? So if the current retry number reaches the maximum value, then the robot logs a message again. So if I just double click the view, you'll see that, the robot logs an error message saying that, the log message application exception of the maximum retries have been reached, right? So that basically logs a message, and then what happens is the transaction number is moved forward. So basically we move on to the next transaction. But if the current transaction has not reached the maximum number of retries, and it has been retried only a few times, then the max retry number indicates that the robot simply logs a warning. So if I double click the activity, you'll see that, the level is 1. And the message says the log message application exception to string is basically has not reached the maximum number of retries, right? So that's basically it's going to be printed at source, right? Now, after that, what happens is that another decision comes into picture, that is the queue retry. So in case the type of the transaction is other than the queue item, then the robot increments the current transaction number, right? As you can see in the assigned part of this activity, the transaction number variable has been assigned to the increment of the next transaction number, right? So it just goes to the next transaction. Similarly, if it is false, so in that case, when the type of the transaction is the queue item, then the retry number is just incremented by 1, right? After restarting the applications, the same transaction is basically in the get transaction data, right? So because of this, the transaction number has the same value. So just in case the queue item variable is processed, the orchestrator deals with retries, so it increments the transaction number, right? So that is what is basically happening in the true section of this particular activity, where the transaction number is increased by 1, and if it's false, then the retries are increased by 1, right? Now, if I go back to the handle system error, the next step that comes into picture is the remove transaction log file. So basically that is to remove the log custom fields of each log message. And finally, we have a try catch block, which talks about taking the screenshot of the workflow. So over here, we invoke the take screenshot.xaml file from the framework folder again. And then over there, we have two arguments. So let's look into the same. So the input argument is basically the in folder, which consists of the folder. And the file path is basically an input and output argument, which consists of the file path where you want to store, right? So that is where basically the screenshots are taken. And now if you have a question, why exactly the screenshots are taken? So you can just understand with the fact that, the screenshots are taken at the time of the exception, so that any user looking back into this, or maybe anything happening with the business process, can be understood with that particular time of the exception, right? So this basically makes life easy for the users. Apart from that, we also have a catch block. So basically, if the screenshot cannot be taken, then it shows a warning saying that, the take screenshot failed with an error, right? So that's basically happening over here. After that, what you'll do is, after you define all the try catch block of screenshots also, you have to finally close all the applications, right? So to finally close all the applications, you invoke the close all applications.xaml file from the framework folder again, which basically closes all the applications. And then if this also fails, what you can do is you can log a message of warning, where you basically display a message saying that, close all applications have failed. And then you again have a try catch block which says kill all processes, right? So if the applications cannot be closed, then you just kill all the processes to make sure that everything is closed. And then if that also has an error, then you again throw an exception showing that, there's some warning happening, and then kill all processes failed, right? So this is where basically you want to close all the processes that are happening, right? So guys, with this, we come to an end of this process transaction state. Now, finally, let's go to the final state, that is the end process state. So end process state, as the name suggests, basically is used to close all the applications. So it simply has a try catch block. So the try block basically has invoke close applications workflow, basically, which is used to close all the applications. And then if there's an error in that, then you just log a message saying that, applications closed to fail normally. So then you have to basically invoke the kill all processes XAML file to just kill all the processes running, right? And the kill all processes is again invoked from the framework folder, right? So with this, guys, we come to an end of the understanding of the workflow of the ReFramework. I hope you've understood all the steps in detail and understood how the workflow of the ReFramework works. So based on this concept, what you can do is, for your business processes, you can change few files, and then you can make sure how your process works in large scale deployments, right? Taking an example of a support ticket system, for every ticket that is generated, maybe we just want to send email, right? So for example, we want to send an automated generated email saying that, hi, we'll be taking care of your problem, right? So what you can do is, for each transaction item that you have, so over here, the transaction item will be the ticket number. So for each transaction item, what you can do is, you can just, in the process transaction part, what you can do is, you can configure the files of init all applications, where you basically initialize the application from where you want to send the email, and then you finally can close all the transactions, right? So this part, I leave it to you how you want to figure out. Well, if you have any further queries related to the working of the RE framework, please comment in the comment section. But before I close with this session, let me just take you through one more XAML file that you need to understand, that is basically the get app credentials. So if you observe in my session, I've explained you all the XAML files that are present in the framework folder, but I skipped the get app credentials XAML file, right? So let me just open this particular XAML file. So when I open the XAML file, what you basically see is this, as the name suggests, is basically used to retrieve the credentials used by the robot to access different applications, right? So basically, we want to retrieve the data of a robot so that the robot can access different applications, right? So a few ways to store the credentials is basically to store them in the orchestrator assets. So when we store the orchestrator credentials, we can basically have a password and a username. If the retrieval of the orchestrator fails, then we basically can just directly catch an exception. So over here in the exception folder, if I just click over here, in the catch section, if I just click on that, you'll see that in the exception, it has a proper if condition. So if our username is nothing or if our password is nothing, then what happens is that basically we have to get the credentials from the Windows vault. So over here, you'll basically get the output of the out password and the username. And then if credential is found, what you basically do is you don't do anything. But yes, if you do not find the credential, then you again request a credential. And then you can display a message saying that, please provide the credentials for access. And then the title of the message could be, hello, this is a robot. Then you can mention the username and the password, and those will be stored in the string password and the out username variables, right? Now, once you give the credentials, if it is not found again, maybe, there's some error, maybe you just might have skipped by not mentioning anything. You can just throw an exception saying that, there are no credentials, but else if there is data that you have mentioned, then you can just add this credential and then make the password to be secure. Now, for each key in basically the password, what you can do is you can just encrypt that particular password and then finally use those particular credentials to access the robots, to get the credentials of the robots to access various applications, right? So basically, guys, this particular XAML file is just to retrieve the credentials used by the robot to access different applications. So with this, guys, we come to an end to this session on UiPath Advanced Training. I hope you've understood all the concepts related to ReFramework. So if you have any further queries related to any file in this ReFramework or any particular machine or any particular state or how the workflow is happening, please comment in the comment section and we'll definitely get back to you. Until then, that's all from my side today. Thank you and happy learning.
I hope you have enjoyed listening to this video. Please be kind enough to like it, and you can comment any of your doubts and queries, and we will reply them at the earliest. Do look out for more videos in our playlist and subscribe to Edureka channel to learn more. Happy learning!